Barron Trump stood at the center of something incredible, something so wild and jaw-dropping that it would go down as one of the most unforgettable moments ever witnessed in a lecture hall. It was a clash no one saw coming, a showdown so electrifying that it left jaws on the floor and minds reeling. Imagine the scene. A packed room at an elite university, the air buzzing with anticipation, and a smug, self-righteous Zelensky fan, a Ukrainian politics obsessive, ready to take down the towering 19-year-old son of a former president. What happened next was nothing short of spectacular, a twist so savage and brilliant it flipped the entire narrative upside down. This wasn't just a debate, it was a battlefield, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have predicted. The Zelensky fan, a wiry junior named Alexei Volkov, wasn't your average student. He strutted into the political science lecture like he owned the place, his laptop plastered with stickers praising Ukraine's controversial leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. Alexei wasn't subtle about his obsession. His social media was a shrine to Zelensky's every move, from fiery speeches to that infamous Trump phone call that had the world talking. To Alexei, Zelensky was a god among men, a symbol of defiance and moral superiority. And Barron Trump, to Alexei, he was just a privileged kid coasting on his father's name, a perfect target for his sharp tongue and sanctimonious rants. The professor, Dr. Elena Markov, a no-nonsense Eastern European scholar with a reputation for stirring chaos, had set the stage with a topic that practically begged for fireworks. Leadership and loyalty in modern politics, hero worship or blind devotion. The lecture hall hummed with restless energy. Students slouched in their seats, some scrolling X for the latest drama, others whispering about the tall figure in the third row, Barron Trump. At 67, he was impossible to miss, his broad shoulders cutting an imposing silhouette against the fluorescent lights. Unlike the others, he didn't fidget or check his phone. He sat upright, his face a mask of calm, his hands folded neatly on the desk. He wasn't there to blend in. He was there to listen, to absorb, and, unknown to everyone, to strike when the moment was right. Alexei, meanwhile, radiated smug confidence, his eyes darting around the room, sizing up his prey. He'd been waiting for this, a chance to flex his intellectual muscle and humiliate someone he saw as an easy mark. Dr. Markov kicked things off with a smirk, her voice slicing through the chatter. The whiteboard glowed with the day's topic, and she wasted no time diving in, packing the front of the room like a predator stalking its next meal. She thrived on tension, loved watching students squirm under her probing questions. Alexei didn't wait for an invitation. He shot his hand up, barely containing his eagerness to dominate the discussion. When Markov nodded, he launched into a tirade about Zelensky's unparalleled leadership, his words dripping with reverence. He painted Zelensky as a beacon of courage, a man who'd stared down empires and exposed the flaws of certain American dynasties, a not-so-subtle jab at Barron's lineage. The room shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward Barron, who didn't flinch. Alexei's attack wasn't random. He spotted Barron earlier that semester, clocked the quiet confidence, the understated presence, and decided he didn't like it. To Alexei, Barron represented everything he despised: wealth, privilege, and a family name tied to policies he blamed for global chaos. The Zelensky fan saw this lecture as his moment to shine, to dismantle Barron's existence in front of everyone. He leaned forward, his voice rising, accusing some people of riding coattails while true heroes like Zelensky fought for justice. The implication hung heavy in the air, a gauntlet thrown down with glee. Students murmured, sensing the brewing storm. Dr. Markov's lips twitched. She loved this kind of chaos, but she stayed silent, letting the tension build. Barron didn't react at first. He sat there, his piercing blue eyes locked on Alexei, unreadable and steady. The room waited, holding its breath, expecting him to shrink or snap. But Barron wasn't like the others. He didn't scramble to defend himself or fire back with cheap shots. He let Alexei dig his own grave, each word piling onto a shaky foundation of arrogance. The Zelensky fan, emboldened by the silence, pushed harder, his voice growing shrill as he mocked Barron's silver spoon upbringing and questioned his right to even be in the room. It was a performance, a spectacle of self-righteous fury, and Alexei reveled in it. Then something shifted. Barron tilted his head ever so slightly, a predator sizing up its prey. The air grew heavier, charged with an unspoken promise. Alexei didn't notice. He was too busy basking in his own brilliance, but the students did. They straightened in their seats, sensing the tide about to turn. Dr. Markov crossed her arms, her eyes glinting with curiosity. She'd seen plenty of debates, but this felt different, rawer, more personal. Barron's silence wasn't weakness. It was a weapon, and he was about to wield it with devastating precision. What came next would leave Alexei scrambling, the room stunned, and the Zelensky fans' ego in tatters. The greatest showdown was only just beginning. The lecture hall crackled with tension, a live wire sizzling under the weight of Alexei Volkov's relentless assault. The Zelensky fan was in his element, his voice booming as he tore into Barron Trump with the ferocity of a man convinced he'd already won. He paced in front of his seat, gesturing wildly, his words a barrage of venom aimed squarely at the quiet giant in the third row. Barron's family name, his wealth, his very existence, nothing was off-limits. Alexei painted him as a symbol of everything wrong with the world, a spoiled heir who couldn't possibly understand the grit of a leader like Zelensky. The students watched, wide-eyed, as the Zelensky fan's tirade grew more unhinged, his face flushed with righteous indignation. Dr. Elena Markov leaned against her desk, her sharp eyes darting between the two figures. She didn't intervene. Why would she? This was the kind of raw, unfiltered clash she lived for, a gladiatorial spectacle in the arena of ideas. Alexei's attack wasn't just personal, it was theatrical, designed to humiliate Barron in front of a captive audience. He sneered about dynasties built on empty promises, his voice thick with contempt, implying Barron's presence was an insult to those who earned their place. A few students snickered nervously, caught up in the momentum of Alexei's bravado, but most stayed silent, sensing something bigger lurking beneath the surface. Barron remained still, a statue carved from granite, his expression betraying nothing. His hands rested lightly on the desk, fingers interlaced, as if he were merely observing a mildly interesting lecture rather than enduring a public flogging. That calm unnerved Alexei, though he'd never admit it. The Zelensky fan doubled down, his voice climbing an octave as he accused Barron of hiding behind his father's shadow, while real leaders like Zelensky risked everything. He flung out buzzwords, privilege, entitlement, corruption, like shrapnel, hoping something would stick. The room buzzed with unease, the air thickening as Alexei's performance teetered on the edge of desperation. Then Barron moved. It was subtle, just a slight lean forward, a shift in posture, but it was enough to silence the room. Alexei faltered mid-sentence, his words catching in his throat as Barron's gaze locked onto him, cold and unyielding. The Zelensky fan blinked, thrown off balance but quickly recovered, smirking as if he'd scored a point. He strutted closer, leaning toward Barron's desk, his tone dripping with mockery. He demanded to know what Barron could possibly say to defend himself, to justify his unearned place in a world shaped by men like Zelensky. It was a trap, a challenge meant to expose Barron as shallow, unprepared, out of his depth. But Barron didn't take the bait. He let the silence stretch, a heavy, deliberate pause that sucked the oxygen from Alexei's bravado. The students shifted in their seats, the nervous laughter replaced by a palpable anticipation. Dr. Markov's smirk widened. She knew a pivot when she saw one. Barron's voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, cutting through the haze like a blade. He didn't shout, didn't grandstand. He simply asked a question, one so simple yet so piercing it landed like a sucker punch. If Zelensky's so perfect, why does his biggest fan sound so scared right now? The room froze. Alexei's smirk vanished, his face twitching as the words sank in. The students exchanged glances, a ripple of shock spreading through the crowd. It wasn't just an insult, it was a dissection, a quiet unraveling of Alexei's entire performance. Barron didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The question hung there, sharp and undeniable, exposing the cracks in Alexei's armor. The Zelensky fan had spent minutes building himself up as untouchable, a crusader for truth, but Barron's words stripped that away in an instant. Scared. Him. The accusation stung, and Alexei's flustered reaction only made it worse. He laughed, a brittle, forced sound, and tried to pivot, dismissing Barron's comment as pathetic deflection. But the damage was done. His hands trembled slightly as he jabbed a finger toward Barron, his voice cracking as he scrambled to regain control. He accused Barron of dodging the real issue, of being too cowardly to engage like a man. The insults flew faster now, but they lacked the earlier venom, sounding more like a tantrum than a takedown. Dr. Markov tilted her head, her amusement fatting into something closer to fascination. She'd seen students crumble under pressure before, but this was different. This was a slow-motion implosion. Barron didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his eyes never leaving Alexei. The Zelensky fan's desperation was palpable now, his attacks growing wilder, less coherent. He ranted about Zelensky's sacrifices, about how Barron could never understand the weight of true leadership. But the more he talked, the smaller he seemed, his words collapsing under their own weight. Barron waited, patient as a hunter, letting Alexei exhaust himself. Then, with surgical precision, he struck again. You're not defending Zelensky. You're begging for his approval. That's not loyalty, it's weakness. The lecture hall erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective gasp. Alexei's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Barron's words weren't loud, weren't flashy, but they hit like a freight train. Weakness. The one thing Alexei prided himself on never showing, laid bare for everyone to see. The students didn't laugh, they were too stunned, but the shift was seismic. Alexei had walked in as the aggressor, the righteous warrior, and now he was floundering, his smug facade shattered by a 19-year-old who hadn't even broken a sweat. Dr. Markov finally stepped in, her voice dry as she redirected the discussion, but the damage was irreversible. Alexei slumped into his seat, his bravado gone, replaced by a simmering mix of rage and humiliation. Barron, meanwhile, resumed his quiet composure as if nothing had happened, but something massive. The Zelensky fan had come for blood, and Barron had turned the tables without raising his voice. The room buzzed with unspoken questions. How had he done it? What came next? One thing was clear, this wasn't over. Alexei wouldn't let it end like this, and Barron knew it. The storm was far from finished. The lecture hall simmered in the aftermath of Barron Trump's quiet demolition of Alexei Volkov. The Zelensky fan sat hunched in his seat, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles whitened. The room pulsed with a strange energy, half awe, half dread, as students stole glances at the two figures now locked in an unspoken war. Barron's calm dismantling of Alexei's ego had been surgical, a masterclass in restraint and precision, but it wasn't enough for the Zelensky fan. Humiliation burned in his chest, a fire that demanded revenge. He wasn't done, not by a long shot, and everyone could feel it. Dr. Elena Markov paced the front of the room, her dark eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and calculation. She'd seen plenty of intellectual brawls in her years teaching political science, but this was something else, a personal vendetta unfolding in real time. She didn't call on Alexei again, didn't need to. The Zelensky fan was already plotting his next move, his jaw clenched as he stared at Barron's broad back. The 19-year-old sat as he always did, upright, unruffled, his presence a silent challenge. To Alexei, that calm was an insult, a taunt he couldn't ignore. He needed to strike back, to reclaim the narrative, and he needed to do it now. The discussion shifted to loyalty and leadership, a topic tailor-made for Alexei's obsession. He seized the opportunity, his hand shooting up like a rocket. Dr. Markov nodded, her lips curling slightly, as if she knew exactly where this was headed. Alexei stood, his voice steady but laced with barely concealed fury. He launched into a passionate defense of Zelensky, painting him as the ultimate symbol of loyalty, a man who'd risked his life for his people while others hid behind gilded walls. The jab at Barron was obvious, clumsy even, but Alexei didn't care. He needed to reassert dominance, to bury Barron under an avalanche of moral superiority. His words flowed like a sermon, each sentence more fervent than the last. He described Zelensky's courage in vivid detail, standing firm against aggression, rallying a nation defying the odds. The students listened, some nodding, others rolling their eyes at the blatant hero worship. Alexei's laptop glowed with a Zelensky sticker, a beacon of his devotion, and he gestured toward it as if it were sacred. He pivoted sharply, his gaze locking onto Barron, and the real attack began. He accused certain people of never knowing loyalty, of skating through life on unearned privilege while true leaders bled for their cause. The room tensed, the air growing thick with anticipation. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a declaration of war. Barron didn't react immediately. He let Alexei's tirade build, each accusation piling onto a shaky tower of outrage. The Zelensky fan's voice rose, his hands slashing the air as he mocked Barron's silence as proof of cowardice. He sneered about dynasties that crumble under scrutiny, his words a thinly veiled assault on Barron's family. A few students shifted uncomfortably, sensing the line being crossed, but Alexei pressed on, drunk on his own righteousness. He demanded to know how someone like Barron could claim any moral ground when he'd never faced a real fight. It was a dare, a desperate bid to provoke a reaction. Then Barron turned his head just a fraction and the room held its breath. His eyes, cold and piercing, met Alexei, and the Zelensky fan faltered, his momentum stuttering. Barron didn't stand, didn't shout. He simply spoke, his voice a quiet thunder that rolled over the lecture hall. You talk about loyalty like it's a speech you memorized. If Zelensky's your hero, why do you sound like his puppet? The words hit like a sledgehammer, sharp and unyielding, cutting through Alexei's bluster with ruthless clarity. The students gasped, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Puppet. The insult was brutal, a direct strike at Alexei's identity as a free-thinking crusader. Alexei's face twisted, his bravado crumbling as he scrambled to respond. He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound, and accused Barron of twisting words to avoid the real issue. But the confidence was gone, replaced by a frantic edge. He pointed at Barron, his voice shaking as he ranted about Zelensky's sacrifices, about how Barron could never comprehend the depth of true loyalty. The more he talked, the more he unraveled, his argument dissolving into a mess of emotion and defiance. Dr. Markov watched, her expression unreadable, but the students could see it. Alexei was losing again, and this time it was uglier. Barron didn't let up. He leaned forward slightly, his tone measured but relentless. You're not loyal to Zelensky. You're loyal to the idea of being better than everyone else. That's why you're so loud about it. The room went silent, the weight of Barron's words sinking in. Alexei froze, his mouth half open, as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. The accusation wasn't just a jab. It was a mirror reflecting Alexei's deepest insecurity back at him. The Zelensky fan had built his entire persona around moral superiority, and Barron had just torn it apart with a handful of sentences. The students didn't cheer or laugh. They were too stunned, but the shift was seismic. Alexei's hands dropped to his sides, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. He'd come at Barron with everything he had, and once again he'd been outmaneuvered. Dr. Markov stepped in, her voice cutting through the haze as she steered the discussion elsewhere, but the damage was done. Alexei sat down, his posture rigid, his eyes burning with a hatred that promised retribution. Barron resumed his quiet vigil, as if the exchange had been a minor interruption, but the truth was undeniable. He'd humiliated Alexei twice now, each time with devastating ease. The lecture ended, but the tension lingered, heavy and unresolved. Students filed out in hushed clusters, their whispers buzzing with speculation. Alexei lingered at his desk, staring at his Zelensky sticker as if it could somehow restore his dignity. Barron walked past, his stride steady, his expression unchanged. But as he reached the door, Alexei's voice hissed through the air, low and venomous, a promise of vengeance too quiet for anyone else to hear. Barron didn't turn back. He didn't need to. The Zelensky fan had been humbled, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. The reckoning was rising, and the next clash would be even more explosive. The stage was set for a showdown that would leave no one unscathed. The atmosphere in the university had transformed overnight into something unrecognizable, a simmering cauldron of whispers, glares, and unspoken challenges that trailed Barron Trump and Alexei Volkov like shadows. What had begun as a single lecture hall skirmish had metastasized into a campus-wide obsession, a saga that students recounted in hushed tones over coffee cups and late-night study sessions. Barron's quiet, devastating takedowns of the Zelensky fan had become the stuff of legend, replayed and dissected on X posts and group chats, each retelling adding layers of myth to the towering 19-year-old who'd barely raised his voice to leave his opponent in ruins. But Alexei wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The humiliation he'd endured wasn't just a wound. It was a festering infection, driving him to a point of near madness as he plotted his revenge. Alexei Volkov had always prided himself on being unbreakable, a self-styled warrior of intellect and principle who wore his devotion to Zelensky like a badge of honor. His dorm room was a shrine to the Ukrainian leader. Posters of Zelensky in his signature olive green fleece lined the walls. A battered copy of a biography sat dog-eared on his desk, and his phone wallpaper glowed with an image of Zelensky mid-speech, fist raised in defiance. To Alexei, Zelensky wasn't just a politician. He was a living testament to resilience, a man who'd faced down empires and emerged unbroken. That obsession had fueled Alexei's identity, giving him a sense of purpose in a world he often found chaotic and unfair. But now, that purpose had been tainted, mocked, and dismantled by Barron Trump, a figure Alexei had underestimated as a shallow trust fund kid with nothing to offer but a famous last name. The Zelensky fan's defeat in the lecture hall had left him sleepless, his mind racing with every word Barron had uttered, puppet, weakness, begging for approval, each syllable a dagger that twisted deeper with every replay. He replayed the moments in his head until they blurred into a nightmare, the gasps of the students, the faint smirk on Dr. Markov's lips, and worst of all, Barron's unyielding calm, as if Alexei's fury was nothing more than a breeze passing through. The shame was unbearable, a public stripping of his pride that he couldn't shake. His friends had tried to console him, slapping his back and muttering about how Barron was just a rich jerk, but their words rang hollow. Alexei didn't want pity, he wanted retribution, a chance to flip the script and bury Barron under the weight of his own arrogance. The opportunity came sooner than he'd expected. Dr. Markov announced a special seminar, an open-floor debate titled Power and Perception, Who Shapes the Narrative. It was a topic tailor-made for Alexei's redemption, a chance to reclaim his dignity in front of a larger audience. The seminar wasn't just for their class. It was open to the entire political science department, drawing a crowd of over 100 students, TAs, and even a few curious professors. Word had spread about the Barron-Alexei feud, and the event promised to be a spectacle, a gladiatorial rematch with higher stakes and no room for retreat. Alexei spent days preparing, hunched over his desk until dawn, scribbling notes, rehearsing arguments and crafting a plan to expose Barron as a fraud. This time, he wouldn't just attack, he'd destroy. The seminar room was a cavernous space, its high ceilings and tiered seating amplifying every sound. By the time Alexei arrived, it was packed, students spilling into the aisles, their murmurs buzzing like static. Barron was already there, seated near the front, his broad frame cutting a stark silhouette against the sea of faces. He wore a simple black sweater, his hands resting lightly on the table in front of him, his posture as composed as ever. Alexei felt a surge of rage at the sight. How dare Barron sit there so calmly, as if he hadn't turned Alexei's world upside down. The Zelensky fan adjusted his jacket, smoothing the Zelensky pin on his lapel, and took a seat across the room. his eyes locked on Barron like a predator tracking its next kill. Dr. Markov opened the seminar with her usual flair, her voice sharp and commanding as she outlined the rules. No interruptions, no personal insults, just pure, unfiltered debate. But everyone knew those rules were flimsy at best. This was war and the gloves were off. Alexei didn't wait long. When the floor opened, he stood, his movements jerky with pent-up energy, and launched into his assault. His voice rang out, steady at first, as he spoke of Zelensky's mastery of narrative, how the Ukrainian leader had turned a nation's struggle into a global rallying cry. He wove statistics into poetry, millions inspired, billions in aid secured, a legacy forged in fire, and the room nodded along, drawn into his fervor. Then came the turn. Alexei pivoted, his tone darkening as he zeroed in on Barron. He didn't name him outright, Dr. Markov's rules forbade it, but the target was unmistakable. He spoke of empty legacies, of figures who borrow power from others without earning it. His words, a venomous arrow aimed straight at Barron's chest. The students leaned forward, their eyes darting between the two, sensing the escalation. Alexei's voice grew louder, his gestures more expansive, as he accused some people of manipulating perception without substance, of coasting on privilege while true leaders bled for their cause. It was a performance, a meticulously rehearsed symphony of outrage, and for a moment it seemed to work. A few students clapped, others whispered in agreement, and Alexei's chest swelled with the taste of victory. Barron didn't flinch. He sat there, his face a mask of stone, letting Alexei's words wash over him like rain on a mountain. The Zelensky fan pushed harder, his voice climbing as he mocked silent beneficiaries who hide behind their name instead of facing real scrutiny. He was baiting Barron, daring him to respond, to crack under the pressure. The room waited, breathless, for the inevitable explosion. And then it came, not with a shout, but with a whisper that carried the weight of a thunderclap. Barron stood, his height casting a long shadow across the room, and spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You're not shaping a narrative, you're screaming for attention. If Zelensky's story is so strong, why does it need you to yell it?" The silence was deafening. Alexei's momentum crashed, his words dying in his throat as Barron struck home. The students froze, their eyes wide, as the weight of the statement settled over them. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a gut punch, a quiet unraveling of Alexei's entire crusade. The Zelensky fan blinked, his face flushing red, and tried to recover, stammering about Barron dodging the point. But the room could see it. His confidence was fracturing, his carefully built tower of righteousness crumbling under Barron's steady gaze. Dr. Markov's lips twitched, her amusement barely concealed, as the seminar teetered on the edge of chaos. Alexei rallied, his voice rising again as he accused Barron of arrogance and ignorance, but the desperation was palpable. He flung out more attacks, Barron's family, his wealth, his unearned spotlight, each one wilder than the last, but they lacked the earlier precision. Barron didn't rise to the bait. He waited, patient and predatory, then delivered the next blow. "You're not defending a leader. You're auditioning to be his echo. Real power doesn't need a cheerleader." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed off the walls. Alexei's face twisted, his hands clenching into fists, as Barron sat back down, his point made, his victory undeniable. The seminar continued, but the energy had shifted. Alexei's subsequent argument sounded hollow, his voice strained, while Barron's silence spoke louder than words. The Zelensky fan had come for blood, and once again Barron had turned the tables, leaving Alexei exposed and reeling. But this wasn't the end. Alexei's vendetta was only growing, fueled by a rage that promised an even darker reckoning. The war was far from over, and the next battle would be the most brutal yet. The university campus buzzed with a feverish intensity in the days following the seminar. The clash between Barron Trump and Alexei Volkov, now a full-blown phenomenon that consumed every corner of student life. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a blood feud, a relentless cycle of attack and counterattack that had spiraled beyond the lecture halls into the digital realm. X posts exploded with hashtags like Barron vs Alexei and Zelensky fan fail. Memes of Alexei's flushed face juxtaposed with Barron's stoic stare flooding timelines. The Zelensky fans' humiliation had gone viral, clips of Barron's devastating one-liners racking up views, while Alexei's frantic rebuttals were mocked mercilessly in comment threads. To the outside world, it was entertainment, but to Alexei, it was an existential crisis, a war he couldn't afford to lose. Alexei Volkov had retreated into a storm of his own making, his dorm room a chaotic mess of crumpled papers, empty energy drink cans, and glowing screens as he scoured the internet for ammunition. The shame of the seminar gnawed at him, a relentless beast that tore at his pride with every notification ping. His followers, once a loyal cadre of Zelensky enthusiasts, had begun to fracture, some unfollowing him, others questioning his obsession in brutal DMs. "Dude, chill, you're making us look bad," one wrote. "Barron owned you, just take the L," taunted another. Each message was a fresh cut, deepening the wound Barron had inflicted with his quiet, surgical precision. Alexei couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. His world had narrowed to one singular goal: destroy Barron Trump no matter the cost. He'd spent hours analyzing Barron, digging into every scrap of public information he could find. Barron's height, his lacrosse days, his rare appearances at his father's rallies. Alexei cataloged it all, searching for a weakness, a chink in the armor of that infuriating calm. He obsessed over Barron's silence, the way he never shouted or flailed, the way he wielded words like a sniper's rifle instead of a shotgun. It drove Alexei mad. How could someone so young, so privileged, be so unshakable? The Zelensky fan convinced himself that Barron's composure was a facade, a mask hiding insecurity or arrogance that he could expose. He just needed the right moment, the right weapon, and he'd bring the whole house of Trump crashing down. That moment arrived with the university's annual Global Voices Forum, a high-profile event where students presented on international issues to a packed auditorium of peers, faculty, and even local media. Alexei signed up immediately, submitting a proposal titled Zelensky's Ukraine, a case study in authentic leadership, a thinly veiled platform to relaunch his assault. Barron, to no one's surprise, was also on the roster, his topic a cryptic power beyond perception, which sent Alexei into a frenzy of speculation. The forum promised a massive stage, over 300 attendees, live-streamed on the university's YouTube channel, and Alexei saw it as his last stand, a chance to reclaim his narrative and bury Barron in front of the world. The auditorium was a sea of anticipation on the night of the forum, the air thick with the scent of coffee and nervous sweat. Students packed the seats, their phones out, ready to capture every moment. Faculty lined the front row, Dr. Markov among them, her dark eyes gleaming with the promise of chaos. Alexei took the stage first, his posture rigid but his energy electric, a coiled spring ready to unleash. He wore a crisp blazer, the Zelensky pin gleaming under the spotlight, and launched into his presentation with ferocious intensity. Slides flashed behind him, images of Zelensky in war-torn streets, charts of Ukraine's resilience, quotes extolling his bravery. His voice boomed, steady and commanding, as he painted Zelensky as the pinnacle of leadership, a man who'd forged unity from chaos. The audience leaned in, captivated by Alexei's passion, his words weaving a tapestry of heroism that felt almost tangible. He spoke of Zelensky's defiance during the Trump call, framing it as a moment of moral clarity against corrupt dynasties, a jab so blatant it drew murmurs from the crowd. He didn't name Barron, but he didn't need to. The implication hung heavy, a dare for Barron to rise and defend himself. Alexei's confidence swelled as he moved through his points, his gestures sharp, his tone unwavering. He was reclaiming the narrative, proving he wasn't the frantic mess Barron had reduced him to. The applause was tentative at first, then grew, a wave of approval that fueled his fire. He stepped back, chest heaving, and shot a triumphant glance at Barron, who sat near the stage, his expression as unreadable as ever. Barron's turn came next, and the room shifted, a collective breath held as he rose. At 67, he dominated the stage without effort, his presence a quiet force that dwarfed Alexei's theatrics. He didn't rush, didn't fidget. He adjusted the mic with deliberate care, then began. His voice was low, resonant, carrying a weight that filled the auditorium without strain. His presentation wasn't flashy. No dramatic slides, no bombastic quotes, just a single phrase projected behind him. Power isn't loud. He spoke of influence, of how true strength lies in what's unspoken, in the ability to stand firm without screaming for validation. The audience listened, spellbound, as he wove a subtle, piercing argument about perception versus reality. Then came the turn. Barron didn't name Alexei just as Alexei hadn't named him, but the target was clear. He spoke of those who shout to be seen, of how obsession with a single figure, any figure, can blind someone to their own flaws. His words were measured, but each one landed like a hammer, cracking the foundation of Alexei's performance. Real leadership doesn't need a megaphone, he said, pausing to let the silence amplify his point. It doesn't need someone else to scream its worth. The auditorium tensed, eyes darting to Alexei, who sat rigid, his hands clenched in his lap. Barron continued, his voice steady. When you're obsessed with proving someone else's greatness, you forget to prove your own. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a stunned murmur that rolled through the seats. Alexei's face drained of color, his triumph evaporating as Barron's words sank in. It wasn't an attack, it was an autopsy, a quiet exposure of Alexei's entire crusade as a hollow shell. The Zelensky fan shot to his feet, his voice cracking as he demanded a rebuttal, breaking the forum's no-interruption rule. Dr. Markov raised an eyebrow but allowed it, sensing the breaking point. Alexei stormed the stage, his blazer askew, and unleashed a torrent of fury. Barron was smug, privileged, ignorant of struggle, a fraud hiding behind platitudes. His voice shook, his hands flailing as he tried to claw back control. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood there, hands in his pockets, letting Alexei's meltdown play out. The audience watched, transfixed, as the Zelensky fan unraveled, his rant growing incoherent, his accusations wilder with every breath. "You don't know sacrifice," Alexei shouted, his voice breaking. "You don't know what it means to fight." The room winced at the desperation, the raw edge of a man teetering on collapse. Barron waited, then spoke, his tone cutting through the chaos. "You're right. I don't scream about fighting, I just do it." The auditorium fell silent, the weight of Barron's calm crashing over Alexei like a tidal wave. The Zelensky fan staggered back, his chest heaving as the reality hit. He'd lost again, and this time it was public, permanent, devastating. The applause for Barron was slow, then thunderous, a roar that drowned out Alexei's trembling silence. He stumbled off the stage, his Zelensky pin catching the light as he disappeared into the crowd, defeated but not destroyed. The breaking point had arrived and Alexei had shattered, but the war wasn't over. His rage, now a wildfire, promised one final, cataclysmic clash. The university campus had become a battleground, its once quiet halls and courtyards now electrified with the fallout of Baron Trump's relentless domination over Alexei Volkov. The Global Voices Forum had been the tipping point, a public execution of Alexei's pride that reverberated far beyond the auditorium's walls. The live stream had racked up tens of thousands of views within hours, clips of Alexei's meltdown and Barron's unshakable calm dissected on X, TikTok, and every group chat in a 10-mile radius. The Zelensky fan's outburst, his wild eyes, his trembling hands, his broken voice, had become a meme, captioned with phrases like, "When your hero can't save you," and Barron 3, Alexei 0. To the world, it was a hilarious spectacle, but to Alexei, it was the end of everything he'd built, a humiliation so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. Alexei had vanished from public view after the forum, retreating to his dorm like a wounded animal licking its wounds. His room, once a proud shrine to Zelensky, now felt like a prison, the posters mocking him with their silent stares. He sat in the dark, the blue glow of his laptop illuminating his haggard face as he scrolled through the endless barrage of taunts. His follower count plummeted, his inbox flooded with vitriol. "You're a joke," Barron broke you. "Give it up," Zelensky stan, each message a fresh lash against his already battered ego. Sleep eluded him, replaced by a manic energy that fueled his obsession. He couldn't let it end like this. Barron had stripped him bare, exposed him as a fraud in front of the world, and the only way out was through one final, apocalyptic showdown that would either redeem him or destroy him completely. He spent days plotting, his mind a whirlwind of rage and desperation. He barely ate, surviving on adrenaline and black coffee as he crafted his ultimate weapon, a viral exposé. Alexei would take the fight to X, the platform where Barron's legend had grown, and turn it against him. He dug deeper than ever, combing through old interviews, paparazzi shots, even obscure Trump family anecdotes, searching for dirt, anything to paint Barron as a hypocrite, a coward, a shadow of the stoic giant he pretended to be. He found scraps, a blurry photo of Barron at a lavish gala, a vague quote from a cousin about his quiet nature, a rumor of a temper tantrum from years ago, and wove them into a narrative of privilege and deceit. It wasn't airtight, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to be loud. The post went live at midnight, a 2,000-word thread titled "The Truth About Barron Trump, the Silent Fraud Exposed." Alexei's fingers shook as he hit send, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and exhilaration. He accused Barron of faking his calm, of using his family's wealth to manipulate perception, of hiding a spoiled, entitled core beneath his powerful silence. He tied it to Zelensky, contrasting Barron's cushy life with the Ukrainian leader's real struggles, framing himself as the underdog truth-teller against a Goliath of privilege. The thread was raw, messy, unhinged, but it worked. Likes and retweets surged, the Zelensky fanbase rallying with cries of "finally" and "expose him." By morning, it was trending, the campus abuzz with whispers of Alexei's comeback. Barron, meanwhile, remained an enigma. He hadn't responded to the forum fallout, hadn't gloated or engaged with the memes. He walked the campus as he always did, tall, steady, untouchable, his silence amplifying his mystique. But Alexei's thread was different, a direct assault that demanded a reaction. Students watched him, waiting for a crack, a sign that the Zelensky fan had finally landed a blow. The tension peaked at the next political science lecture, a routine class that became anything but. The room was packed, standing room only, as word spread that both Barron and Alexei would be there. Dr. Markov strode in, her smirk sharper than ever, sensing the powder keg about to ignite. Alexei arrived first, his chin high despite the dark circles under his eyes, his Zelensky pin gleaming defiantly. He took a seat near the front, his laptop open to X, refreshing obsessively as his thread climbed higher. Barron entered moments later, his stride unhurried, his black sweater a stark contrast to the room's nervous energy. He sat 2 rows behind Alexei, his presence a silent thundercloud that shifted the air. The students buzzed, phones discreetly recording, as Dr. Markov launched into the day's topic, legacy and accountability. It was a match thrown into gasoline, and Alexei seized it. He stood, his voice hoarse but resolute, and spoke of Zelensky's legacy, how it was built on action, not birthright, how accountability meant facing the world's judgment head-on. He turned, his eyes locking onto Barron, and went for the kill. Some people dodge accountability with silence, hiding behind a name while others fight for truth. The room tensed, a collective gasp swallowed by anticipation. Alexei's thread had primed the crowd, and they waited for Barron to falter, to lash out, to prove the fraud label true. He didn't. He sat there, hands folded, letting Alexei's words echo into the void. Dr. Markov called on Barron next, her tone neutral but her eyes glinting. He stood, the room hushing as he adjusted the mic. His voice was calm, deliberate, a blade wrapped in velvet. Legacy isn't a post you write at midnight. It's what you do when no one's watching. And accountability, that's owning your obsession, not projecting it onto someone else. The words landed like a bomb, precise and devastating. Alexei's face twitched, his bravado crumbling as Barron continued. "You've spent weeks screaming about me. I haven't said a word about you until now. Who's hiding?" The room erupted gasps, murmurs, a few shocked laughs as Alexei's thread backfired spectacularly. Barron didn't stop. He dissected Alexei's crusade with surgical calm. "You call me a fraud because I don't shout, but you're the one begging for validation, chasing a man's shadow instead of building your own. That's not truth, that's a tantrum." The auditorium shook with the weight of it, students leaning forward, phones trembling in their hands. Alexei shot up, his voice a ragged yell as he accused Barron of twisting reality. But it was too late. The Zelensky fan's final stand was collapsing, his rage no match for Barron's icy precision. Dr. Markov stepped in, her voice cutting through the chaos, but the damage was done. Alexei sank into his seat, his hands shaking as Barron sat down, his point made, his victory absolute. The lecture ended, but the fallout was seismic. Alexei's thread was buried under a wave of mockery, his followers deserting him, his Zelensky obsession now a punchline. Barron walked out, his stride steady, his silence louder than ever. The Zelensky fan had gambled everything and lost, his final humiliation a spectacle etched into campus lore. For Barron, it was just another day, a quiet, crushing triumph that left no doubt. He was untouchable, and Alexei was finished. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, a quiet shift emerged. Alexei withdrew from the semester, his dorm emptied, his X account deleted. Some said he'd transferred, others whispered he'd cracked under the pressure. Barron continued, his legend growing, a figure who turned a fanatic's vendetta into a lesson in power. The clash had been brutal, scandalous, unforgettable, a testament to tension's allure, where one man's fall became another's rise. And for those who'd watched it unfold, it was a reminder. Sometimes the loudest voice loses, and the quietest one wins everything. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.